To get a full sense of their educational offerings, we should watch them talk about somebody they don't like. There's also a PragerU educational video about Karl Marx.
Oh, this is gonna be good.
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, I would imagine. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Oh man, I need the cartoons to really get it.
Ideas have consequences. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, and sometimes catastrophic, like the ideas of Karl Marx. Born in Trier, Germany in 1818, Marx didn't invent communism. But it was on his ideas that Lenin and Stalin built the Soviet Union, Mao built communist China, and innumerable other tyrants, from the Kims in North Korea to the Castros in Cuba, built their communist regimes. Ultimately, those regimes and movements calling themselves Marxist murdered about 100 million people and enslaved more than 1 billion. Marx believed that workers, specifically those who did manual labor, were exploited by capitalists, the people who owned, as Marx put it, the means of production, specifically factories, but who did very little physical labor themselves.
Can we pause?
Only a workers' revolution.
Yeah.
This is just like a meta comment. There's nothing that drives me crazier than listening to people who, like, I know are about to present like a very skewed view of Marx and Marxism, right? Whenever they use the phrase like means of production, right? It's like that kind of like keyword understanding, right? Like there's a few things about Marx. It's like, you know, invented communism or didn't invent communism, wrote the Communist Manifesto, and this whole thing is about the means of production. Anyway, I noticed that from like the critics, they say that terminology way more than I ever hear anybody who's like an actual Marxist talking about.
That's true. Like, yeah, you really get the sense that it's one of, like, you know, like they've got a little index card and it's like, this is like one of like 5 things about Marx they have written down the index card.
They love that shit. Those communists, they love those means of production, baby.
Marx wrote in Das Kapital could correct
That's another
this
one too, Das Kapital.
What would that revolution look like? Marx and his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, spelled it out point by point in the Communist Manifesto. It included the abolition of property and inheritance and the centralization of credit, communication, and transport in the hands of the state, and a lot more along the same lines. In other words, the state owns and controls pretty much everything. This notion was widely discussed and debated in European intellectual circles during Marx's lifetime. But nothing much came of it until Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1917. This changed everything. Despite its repeated economic failures, Lenin's Russia, which became known as the Soviet Union, became the model for dictators around the world. Wherever Marx's ideas were practiced, life got worse. Not by a little, but by a lot. There is not a single exception to this rule.
That's insane.
Not the Soviet Union, not Eastern Europe, not China, not North Korea, not Vietnam, not Cuba, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, not Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, and famine follow. So if cataclysmic failure, meaning terrible human suffering, is the inevitable legacy of Marxism, why do so many people, and now especially young people, defend it? The most common answer Marxism's advocates offer is that they, whoever they are, Lenin, Stalin, Chavez, never really practiced Marxism. They all somehow got it wrong. Marxism, we are told, is, at its essence, about sharing what we have, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, as Marx put it. Maybe that sounds good to you, but what does it mean? Who determines ability? Who determines need? The answer is the state, the ruling elite. Under Marxism, that's who has all the power. That's why the truth is this. Marxist dictators like Lenin, Mao, and Pol Pot really did get Marxism right. They wanted absolute power, and Marxism gave them the way to get it. Karl Marx never had to face the consequences of his theories. He lived most of his adult life breathing the free air of London, England, living off the generosity of his collaborator and patron, Engels, who, as it happens, inherited his money from his wealthy merchant father. Marx spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, researching and writing. Although he was obsessed with the term scientific, he was never able to marshal data to prove his theories. There's a good reason for this. There was no data to prove his theories. For all his time in the library, Marx couldn't find any evidence to suggest that capitalism, the free exchange of goods and services through privately owned business, was a passing phase. Throughout the industrial age, working conditions constantly improved and wealth expanded. Marx had to rely on outdated reports to make his case. And even then, he had to manipulate the data to get it to conform to his predetermined theories. But Marx really had no interest in proving his theories. He knew that they could be put into practice only by brute force. He said so himself. Of course, in the beginning, communism cannot be effected except by a means of despotic inroads, he wrote. His ends could be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. All existing social conditions. That's religion, family, personal possessions, freedom, and democracy. They all had to go in order to achieve Marx's vision of an earthly paradise. But since few people give up their liberties and property voluntarily, creating a Marxist state has always required guns, prisons, and summary executions. Marx's many disciples from Lenin on never considered this a problem. Some, like revolutionary poster boy Che Guevara, considered it a bonus. I don't need proof to execute a man, Che is said to have boasted. I only need proof that it's necessary to execute him. If you're still a fan of Marxism after all the death, suffering, and destruction it's caused, that's your right. But own up to it. Don't hide behind the "it's never really been tried" line. It has. I'm Paul Kengor, professor of political science at Grove City College for Prager University.
My man's bringing back the Caesar haircut over there.
Yeah, I thought it, like when they were going through, so I mean, there are two things here, right? One is that like almost nothing, like there are like 45 seconds of Marx in this video, but most of it's about the
and also for accusing him of not using enough data, almost nothing I saw there was cited or any form of proof to any of their claims. But keep going.
Yeah, right. No, for sure. I mean, like there was, because like there were a lot of claims there that like are not like general knowledge. Everybody would agree to, things that would have been nice to see a little bit, right? The claim that there's nothing in the 3 volumes of Capital that counts as data, or maybe there was, but it was manipulated. In what way, we don't really know. Yeah. But also, like half of it, like most of it, more than half, was on the 20th century communist states. Mm-hmm. There was no, I mean, there was this kind of mention of Marxists, who didn't like, who criticisms of them, but they don't really say why, right? You're left in the dark about what the criticisms were. And also, as they were going through the list of, of the states and said, it totally made things worse here, and here. I kept thinking, man, do they have the balls to include Cuba in that list? Because that would be something, right? Like, say that, pre-1959 to the decades after, that healthcare and infant mortality and doctor-patient ratio and literacy, like that. It's like, racial integration. It's like, no, nothing good happened in Cuba. They completely would have been better off if Batista instead.
I mean, yeah. And that's the underlying argument too. I mean, could you imagine a continuation of, Tsarism in Russia having been, a positive experience for folks? I mean, to say what they're saying, I think is ridiculous. Specifically about, China, Russia, and Vietnam.
Especially like, okay, so China, and this does actually put it in pretty sharp relief, like the issue with this, because like they don't consider it even as a possibility that anything that was done in any of these states differed from the original politics of Marx or Marxism. So fine, let's play by that rule, right? Whatever happened in any self-declared communist state totally aligns, with what Marx advocated. Great. So that would include like China in the last 40 years, right?
Yeah.
And if so, right, like that is, just in terms of rapid economic development, people going from, living in peasant huts to modern apartments, like that's probably the greatest success story for that in the history of the world. in a really weird hybrid system that we would have tons of criticisms of, no doubt. But like also, I mean, I don't know, why doesn't that count?
Yeah, no, I mean, but this is what they do, and I mean, I would imagine many of the people watching this are like sympathetic, to our views on Marx and Marxism and this history. But why do they do this tactic, right? I'm, for one, I'm not somebody who's afraid to talk about the Soviet Union or China, and I will go toe to toe with all these guys about this kind of stuff, right? But they do it to distract from Marx and Marxism, because what immediately happens for people like us, we immediately get into this kind of conversation where we're sort of forced to like defend 100 years of social movements and conflict in different societies, right? Which is a difficult position, and also, to be in, like, just like on a on this on the scale of the argument is like too big, right? But it's just an impossible conversation to have on any meaningful level, right? And so what they really do is they kind of disrupt the fundamental truths as to why Marx and Marxism are attractive to people, right? Primarily by exposing the fundamental flaw and lie of capital society, right? Which is that you are free. One of the things that was and I think you and I both agree on this, like Communist Manifesto is a really incredible text, right? Because it exposes both what's happening to people on the shop floor, right? How their wages are being exploited. They're not getting paid for the work that they're putting into, into production. And then when they leave, they are then preyed upon by the landlord, the shopkeeper, I can't remember the other folks who are coming after these, 19th century workers, right? But it's basically exposing this fact that under capital society, you are getting exploited at the job, and then you leave, and then because of all these other things that are made to be extremely expensive, things that used to be publicly controlled or free, right, or have now been enclosed, right, are now private property that you have to buy or rent from somebody. By exposing that, Marx, it reveals this fundamental inequity of capitalism, right? Which is that if you're a worker, oh boy, it's going to be really, really hard to get ahead. And if you're somebody who owns things, this system is designed to benefit you, right? And what Marx does with that truth is he turns it into a political question instead of just an economic question. And that's why he is somebody who, is extremely important, then and today. And that's why they try to do everything, even in that video, to avoid like dealing with like the fundamental like points of Marxism and like why Marx is an attractive thinker to folks, and instead try to focus on like, oh, well, these are the excesses of this criticism, right? So like, again, I'm somebody who will, talk and really wrestle with like the truths and the reality of like the Soviet Union and China with folks. So I'm not afraid of those conversations. But like, what's really important though is that they're trying to prevent you from taking that analysis that Marx was writing then to a contemporary society today.
Yeah, right, absolutely. And I think it's also really telling that they trot out the means of production at the beginning.
But that's all. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you again. If you're just somebody who just is casually like, I don't know, bumping around ideas and hearing about Marxism, right? Those are the terms. It's like, means of production, and then basically the workers are being abused, right? And there's no it doesn't ever go beyond there, right? And most people, just how we are, right? We just sort of have surface level understandings of things. And PragerU like exists not to debunk those kind of surface level understandings, but to try to cement them, right? To get like some professor of political science on here to tell them, like, hey, your half-assed ideas about what Marx and Marxism are actually true, right?
Yeah, right. And so also though, the means of production come up for a minute at the beginning, but then like kind of forget about it. It's like, okay, so what did Marx thought should be done with these means of production? You wouldn't know from this video, right? No. You just knew. All it really tells you is that Marx advocates some kind of change or another and thinks it's going to have to be implemented by force and violence, which sounds bad. I do really like the Communist Manifesto, although I also wish that someday one of these guys would read a second thing by Marx. Critiquing the Goth program maybe would be nice, or like that would also take you a whole hour. But but one way that like the fact that it is just like these sort of vague nuggets and maybe they skim through the Communist Manifesto, it's like, yeah, right. So in 1848, when continental Europe was entirely ruled by various, kings and emperors, and Great Britain had some quasi-democratic processes, but also the great majority of the, certainly the working class population didn't have the vote. Then, yeah, his position was that, like violent, like insurrectionary tactics were the only way that you could overthrow that system at that time. But also there are tons of places in the 1880s and 90s, when Marx and then Engels, say things like, yeah, in advanced capitalist democracies where workers have the vote, like Great Britain, you could have socialism come about by a socialist party, winning power electorally. Now, they did worry that capitalists would respond to that the way that slave owners responded to the election of Lincoln, which, I think the 20th century shows not an unreasonable concern. See Salvador Allende. But like, that's an incredibly misleading characterization of their, I think that it's complicated. I think they said a lot of different things over the course of their lifetime about transition to socialism and how that works. It's not always obvious how to fit it together, but certainly this is like a two-dimensional cartoon caricature of that.
Yeah, and I think like what's frustrating and like maybe it might seem to some people like why you and I are tiptoeing around things is because there are so many raging debates amongst like Marxists and socialists on these things that you don't want to sit here and be like, this is the definitive thing that like Marx said or Marx meant, right? Which is why it's so amazing to watch these guys say it so clearly. But it's like one of those things where you almost have to just like treat it all surface level like they do, right? I'm amazed that they didn't say, for example, dictatorship of the proletariat, because that's a favorite one they used for.
I think that would make it onto the index card.
What?
You'd think that would make it onto the index card.
Oh, absolutely. And I would just say, like, in that context, consider like what the opposite reality is, right? When Marx is talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, he's talking about, society working for working people, working for the proletariat. He compared like, and to consider that, like, think about what we live under right now. We live under the dictatorship of the bosses. You live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Like, look at what just happened in this pandemic, for example, right? The pipes of money that were coming from the federal government, they just don't flow to everyday people in the way that they did to like major corporations and banks and things like that, right? Because this entire system, from property law, to just like stimulus in general, functions in a way to benefit that class, right? And like that's what they're talking about when they're talking about like smashing the state or like just upending everything that exists, right? Because it's this fundamental understanding that Marx has that these things didn't all develop by like accident to work out this way. It's a kind of recognition that these things developed with the very specific goal in mind, which was to exploit working people as much as you can get away with and still have a functional society.
No, totally. And I think also, dictatorship of proletariat is one of those things that it's an expression that Marx and Engels over thousands of pages use like 3 or 4 times, maybe.
Yeah, exactly, that's true.
A little more if you include the letters, maybe, but like not much more. And yeah, I think like trying to break apart exactly what that what that phrase meant to them. That's like something that. If we were Marx scholars, we could sit here and have an argument about that for the next 2 hours, but like one thing that you definitely, because again, it's ambiguous. There's room for, just like there's tons of room for disagreement. But also though, one big clue is that they did actually point to one actually existing thing as an example of what a dictatorship of the proletariat would look like in a transitional post-revolutionary society. And that was the Paris Commune, which was not like proto-Stalinism, was actually ultra-democratic. That like the things, if you read The Civil War in France, another very short Marx pamphlet, could read it in an afternoon. But if you read The Civil War in France, the things that Marx praises about the Paris Commune are that that they made every state official recallable by their constituents at any time for any reason. Could make more salary, except, and there were abandoned factories that were turned over to workers' associations to run as cooperatives, presumably, and so it seems like the features that appeal to them about the commune are kind of the opposite of the scare story that people get when they hear that phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's 100% on point, and I would also add, to all of this as well, because we've just sort of honed on a couple things in Marx, is like the other fundamental distinction too that Marx does, again, that they're not going to interact with in that kind of video, is like the fundamental reality that we live in a class-based society, and in fact that classes are how most of human history has been sort of governed. Not entirely. That's something that I think a lot of people misunderstand. But if you look at a society and you look at the different classes that have developed in it, you're going to have a good understanding, at least, as to where the conflicts are in that society, and can maybe see in which direction that they're going, right? And that's like the kind of like understanding of history. Again, it's just a refusal to deal with Marx. I mean, I always like, and I know you like Hitchens as well, in the sense that it's kind of, as a complicated figure. I always sort of liked, Hitchens saying that, like, even not believing in like the potential of socialism or communism, that he would still consider himself to be a Marxist, right? Because it's like a way of analysis and viewing the world.
There's actually a place, in fact, during the worst period of Hitchens's politics, which makes it like all that much funnier to see it show up there. There's an exchange that he had with Norman Finkelstein in like 2004, where he actually like brings up there, like it's sort of an aside, but he's like, no, I mean, I still believe in the Marxist theory of history, and he even like mentions like the J.A. Cohen book, Karl Marx's theory of history and defense. It's like, no, I mean, I think this is an accurate tool for understanding, how history works.
So amazing.
Even if I no longer think that it's a viable political program, what he thought about that is ambiguous. But